Good evening. Good evening and welcome. I'm Crystal Collins Judd, the president of Sarah Lawrence College, and I am delighted to welcome you all here tonight. We are launching tonight on a series this year that we will be engaged with. We hope that you will join us often, called Difference in Dialogue, where we are bringing together a variety of perspectives into conversation in a moment where we think that's a very important exercise for us to all engage in. As this first panel, Women in Office, we will set the tone for what's happening. You'll see that we have not all our chairs filled yet. Two of our participants are on their way in a busy season where people are on their way to various places. Before I introduce and start with our panel, a couple of things that I will encourage you to join. Look, if you go to our website, you look for Difference in Dialogue, you'll see that we have a panel in November of college and university presidents coming together to talk about campuses, campus climate, that we have a second panel on the bounds of free speech that brings together an activist, a Black Lives Matter activist with a free speech absolutist in conversation with one another about the bounds of free speech, on religious pluralism later this year. So key topics of interest, but in this season, as we approach the elections, women running for office seemed a timely moment for dialogue. The one ground rule we set after the panel talks is that for the first questions, we reserve those for the students. If you're a student at Sarah Lawrence right now, raise your hand. All right? Everybody else, look around. It's very important for us that this is an event where we bring our students and our community together in dialogue, but as an educational institution, that this experience is one in which our students engage. So there will be time for you to have questions, but we will privilege the students in the first question. I promised only the briefest introduction, so we are delighted that Katie Hood, who is the CEO of the One Love Foundation and also a visiting lecturer at Duke University in the Sanford School of Public Policy, agreed to come moderate for us tonight. Katie will do the other introductions, but Katie is someone who's really given thought to women's leadership and what women's leadership means, and she's also a member of the community here in Bronxville, so we're delighted to have those two things come together, and I will hand off to Katie. Great. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction and for having this event. Thank you to all of you for coming. This is indeed a really important topic and a very relevant topic right now where we are. Just a little bit more on my own path to why am I sitting here. I started out actually in college as a public policy major and then very quickly decided that I wasn't sure I had what it took to run for office, quite honestly. It seemed really hard, seemed a little bit scary. So I went to the philanthropic world. I spent time at the Michael J. Fox Foundation. I'm now at the One Love Foundation, which is working to educate young people across the country about healthy and unhealthy relationships as a strategy for ending domestic violence. We were started after a young woman named Yardley Love was killed at the University of Virginia in 2010. After her death, her cousin actually is my best friend in Bronxville. I was there that day, and it was very clear that no one had been educated about the warning signs of abuse, therefore no one could help. No one knew what they were seeing. So that doesn't really work today, doesn't have politics at the core, but before I started this work, I was teaching this class at Duke. Working with 16 to 20 women a semester to think about their own leadership aspirations, to introduce them to the history of women's leadership in this country, the sociology around gender, and also to introduce them to women I respected and thought were leaders so that it could become more real to them. So when I was asked to moderate this panel, I was thrilled because I think one of the biggest barriers to women running for office is the lack of relatable role models. And so anytime you can talk to women who've run for office and built careers around leading and representing, I think it's a great opportunity to make it real. So I hope we'll have lots of questions. And we're eager for our other panelists to come too, but we're off to a great start with these guys. So I'm actually not going to introduce them.
She is?
Hey. Welcome. So what I'm actually going to ask everyone to do is introduce themselves, and we'll start to my left and go right. Who they are, what their path to elected office looked. Well, let's start with when you first realized you wanted to run for office and why. and then what your path has looked like. And we'll let everybody tell their story to where they are today. Does that sound good?
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. So, hello, everybody. It's nice to see you. My name is Sheila Marcotte, and thank you for having me here today. And the lovely two ladies to my right. It's nice to see you, Andrea. So, your first question is, my answer is going to be probably not what you expected. I never wanted to run for office, and how I got involved was really due to the tragic events of 9/11, and I was sort of drafted. I was serving on the planning board in the village of Tuckahoe at the time, and I was loving it because Tuckahoe at that time was, our main street, our most main and center corridor, if you will, on one side of the village, was lucky enough to have a developer come in, spend money, spend the time, and really develop this into a great area in terms of it had been run down and neglected for many, many years. So I was thrilled to be on the planning board, thrilled to be a part of that. And 9/11 happened, and it claimed one of our very respected and beloved trustees, Michael McHugh. So I was asked to fill his seat, and I said I will do that, and I will only do it till the unexpired term. So when his term is up, I'm in, then I'm out, and it didn't work out that way. Then they said, well, I'll just run. It's easy. I had no political experience. No political acumen or sense of politics at all. I was a psychology major, an education minor. I had worked a number of years on Wall Street, and politics was just not something I ever said, oh, I'm going to run for office. So that's how I started. And from then on, I won that election, and I have a story about that. I'll tell it very quickly. Yeah, my running mate, she was sort of my mentor, her name was Sheila, and my name is Sheila. And the powers that be said, well, that's not a good idea to have two, women with the same name on the ballot. We were like, well, what's the problem? What could the confusion be? So Sheila and Sheila ran, and we ran against a young fellow by the name of PJ. And I didn't really want to run, but I did it, and I did not expect to win at all. It was the least likely scenario. When I looked at all the combinations, I was not likely to win. So election night comes, and they told me I lost. So I was happy, I'll be honest with you. I was relieved. I was like, oh my God, yeah, I was hanging out. I went and ordered a glass of wine. I was hanging out with my family. And about a half hour later, somebody tapped me on the shoulder. Yeah. And meanwhile, Governor Pataki had called. He was the governor at the time. Congratulated the other Sheila, offered his condolences to me. And a half hour later, I got the tap. And there's been a little confusion with the names. They're like, oh, you won. Oh. So it was just a wild ride, if you will, from the very beginning. And so I started as a village trustee. I stayed there a couple of years. I went to the town board for a number of years, and then I served about 8 years on the county board. I've loved every minute of it. So, and I guess we'll get more into that later.
Definitely,
so thank you.
That's a great, I didn't know that story.
All true, all true.
Oh, I wanted to run for everything. And I ran for high school junior president, and I didn't vote for myself because my mother told me, you women, you just don't do that, and I lost by 1 vote.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
True story.
No.
To
Lesson.
a boy who voted for himself.
Oh, boy.
So,
There's a lesson there.
and then I grew up in Albany, and then my high school had a internship program, and I got to go work in Governor Rockefeller's office for almost a full year. And then he hired me after high school, and then I worked for this amazing man. His lawyer was named Dick Parsons, who right now is running CBS and he ran, you name it, Amazon and Citicorp. And I had the bug early on and just loved working for Governor Rockefeller, because he kind of fit back then. He was a very socially progressive and very fiscally liberal, very socially progressive and conservative on the fiscal side. So, and I just thought there were injustices everywhere I was going to personally fix.
Exactly.
So, my favorite political story. So my grandfather worked for Mayor Erastus Corning, who was the Albany, and you just were a Democrat in Albany. Yeah. That was it. So of course I registered a Republican because I was 18, and you had to do the opposite.
Whatever they were telling you.
I am not lying. The first snowstorm at my grandpa's house, right over by Albany Academy, they picked up the plow blade in front of his house and moved it to the next house to let them know that they knew that I had registered in the, isn't that funny?
That
I
is
love
funny.
that, yeah. Just picked
Politics
up
is
the-
local, very
Politics
local.
is local.
Yes,
Isn't
it
that
is.
funny? I love that story, yeah. And you know, but the thing is, my dad and my grandfather never made me be someone else. It was like they kind of rolled their eyes, but they were very supportive, and that I credit. And then I went to Wellesley College and honestly saw the power of women and what women could do. And then I went to law school, and I have just loved.
So when did you first run for office?
I joined the zoning board, sort of started like Sheila, and then I ran for trustee, and we had a wonderful mayor, Nancy Hand, before me in the village. And when Nancy retired, I was a trustee and ran for Nancy's job.
So how many years have you been mayor of Bronxville?
13.
13 years.
Wow.
More than the locusts, right? Don't they come every 11?
It's also really funny, for those of you who know Bronxville, it's a very small place, and you meet with the school kids, and my kids, I have 4 kids under 13, if they see her walking down the street, they're like, it's the mayor, it's the mayor.
Right.
Like, it's really important to them to see you in the community and about, and I think it's really important, so you do a great job. And yes, Andrea.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, good. I'm happy to see you, Sheila.
How are you?
Well, good, good, good. And Mary, you know, I guess we've crossed paths over the years.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It's a lot of fun. I didn't know that about, that was a funny story.
Yeah.
Sheila. I never knew that. So I didn't have a bug. I was growing up in New York City, and you know, I grew up in a time where people, like women, weren't doing these kinds of things, and, you know, black women weren't doing these kinds of things. I mean, certainly Shirley Chisholm, but I mean, so this was not in my vision at all. And so I never thought I'd be in politics. I never aspired to do anything like that. The opportunity came when I moved to Yonkers. And I moved to Yonkers during well, I didn't know, it was actually pre-desegregation. So I didn't realize that there were any issues. And so, you know, you know, we happened, it was really interesting because my husband he's deceased now, so, but he was Irish, and I didn't realize that had we moved 5 blocks up, it would have been all white. Had we moved 5 blocks back, it would have been all black or brown. We just happened to find this block that had everybody, and I thought this was like, you know, the best place in the whole world. And so that was always my vision of what Yonkers was. And then a few years later, it turned out that you know, with the desegregation and lawsuits and so on. So I had already been involved in the PTA. I was working with New York Tel, AT&T. The history is long and varied. But I did and I was also a journalist that I started working for Gannett newspaper, but I couldn't get involved because I was, you know, objective and so on and so forth. But my kids were going to be bused in what was you know, possibly a very hostile and dangerous environment. And so we started working with the political people who were trying to comply. I mean, here we were now in the 90s, and there were 3 candidates for mayor in Yonkers, and 2 of them did not want to comply with desegregation. The one that did was the one that I was supporting. So I also was supporting a friend of mine who was sitting right there, who was running to be the first African-American woman elected in the city of Yonkers. So because I had, you know, different, you know, I had the journalism, teaching, I'd done a lot of things, marketing, and so they asked me to help her, and I did. So I helped her with policy and writing speeches and so on, and when she got through the primary, Then I was able to work with the mayoral candidate who was the Democrat who was planning to comply with the desegregation order. So they all won. And at that point, he asked me to join his administration, which, you know, was kind of a happy byproduct. Now, just to go back, as I said, I'd grown up in public housing, and I always tell people my dad was a World War II decorated veteran, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, served in the segregated army, and when he came out, the GI Bill that worked for his white colleagues did not work for him. Black soldiers were just not eligible. The public housing was the alternative. I went to public schools, and even when I was in corporate America, because in the corporation that I worked in, women, minorities weren't able to move up the ladder. They moved up the ladder due to, I got an opportunity to move up the ladder due to a class action suit that says you can't keep discriminating against people. My mom, who typed 100 words a minute, could not get a job as a black woman in corporate America, but she did climb the ladder in civil service. I tell you all of that to say that when I got into government after this particular period, and I realized that what the same government that had segregated the army and, you know, made covenants that said black people could never actually benefit from the GI Bill was the same government that made public housing and the same government that said you could have a public education. It was the same government that created civil service, which was the same government that allowed for discrimination, and it all crystallized for me that you could be a barrier or you could be a help. And so in the course of those 4 years, someone asked me, not for me, but because they wanted to get back at the city council president at the time who had turned against the Democrats, and they said, oh, why don't you go run for that seat, you know, give her a run for her money. And I realized that I was not going to beat her citywide. I mean, we're just still fighting, you know, to integrate the city. So I didn't see that. But that seed was planted, and I did see an opportunity in a county legislative seat. And so I ran against an incumbent because I was concerned with some of the things that were going on. And I won, and the rest really has been an unfoldment that I would never, ever have anticipated. So I went from the county legislature, and that. So someone planted the seed, and then I realized that, you know, you could really do good things or bad things in government.
And you're the current Senate Democratic leader.
That's right. That's right.
And someone actually, some of my colleagues at One Love were at a meeting with a women's advisory board in White Plains last night, and they said that nothing gets done without you behind it. Just so you know.
Oh my!
They didn't even know that I was moderating this
That's
panel.
so-
They're like, "This is the person we need to talk to." I'm like, "Well, hello." No,
Hi, Katie.
yeah, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. One love, girl.
Exactly. No, but I think there is that, what's interesting, like I have never run for office, but when my first big leadership job was being CEO of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and I'd been there for 5 years when they offered me at a pretty young age to be the CEO, and I turned it down. And I had all the usual reasons. I just had a baby, I was pregnant with my second, I couldn't possibly. We hired the wrong person, that didn't work, and one of my mentors said to me, what's going on? And, you know, I'm going to tell the board that you need to be the CEO. And I said, no. And he said, I'm not asking you for your opinion, I'm telling you what I'm going to tell the board. And I bring that up because he pushed me through that internal barrier. When I looked at it later, I realized what I had was a lot of fear of failure that was keeping me from jumping in, and I needed a shove through. So one question that I wasn't originally going to think about it, but your story sort of reminded me of this, or what are the shoves that you've got? You talked about sort of the shove through as well. Like you guys hadn't really thought about elected office, but who were some of the people that helped build you, or who are some of the mentors or advisors who got you to the place where you could take that step forward? And how important or not important was that in your life? Yeah, you can start.
Doesn't matter.
Why don't we start with Mary? And then we'll go.
No,
We could all talk a long
Yeah.
time. We're
Yeah.
politicians.
we get paid by the word.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, actually, it was my father, because I was a little bit, I took different, I went to an all-girls Catholic school, and when there were big issues in Albany, abortion was the big issue in my,
Still
and
is.
I didn't want to go to a lot of these marches. I didn't feel the same as what my school was. And my father would call up and say, Mary's not going to go. And I grew up in a time, you know, I call it the miscongeniality time, where you tried really hard to conform. And he was a man who, and there were a couple things, well, like he got kicked out of the Elks Club because I wrote a letter, why did the Elks Club not have women?
Right.
And they published the letter in the Troy paper, and then they asked my father to leave the Elks Club, but he never he was just somebody who said, believe in things, and then.
And he stood by you.
And stood by me. So honestly, it was my dad.
Yep. What about you, Sharon?
Hi, Shelley. Hi, Senator.
I needed a lot of pushes because I never really wanted to take the plunge and run. I think the thought of losing or the failure was a big obstacle for a lot of people, and you mentioned it. And I just was always fearful because I didn't really have a background in politics. I didn't go to college for politics or any of that. So my family gave me a lot of support, and my mom and dad. And the two pushes I needed was to run for trustee, and then when I ran for the county board. And I didn't want to, and I said, my first thought was, I know nothing about county government, and it's so different, right? And it's so different from a village perspective or even a town. It's a whole different ballgame. So I had a lot of people pushing me, but I'm glad they did.
I'll let you answer this, and then we'll have you introduce yourself.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody. I mean, I didn't have a lot of people who were. Well, when I asked them, then they said, all right. So the person who had planted the seed, were pushing me for their own interest. And when I realized that this was something I probably, as far as I was concerned, had to do, I did start talking to people to say, well, what do you think? What do you think? And then people started saying, oh, yeah, oh, do it. And then, you could kind of see the excitement. But, for me, it was almost something that was inside. Once that seed got planted and I realized how things don't happen if somebody isn't willing to make it happen. And I just felt that I had almost, like the imperative to make it happen. And I would never, like, there are people who run for things just to get their name out, or they run for things just because it could be fun or whatever, but I've never run for any office that I didn't feel like somewhere that I was the person who was needed to do the thing. So in that, and even when I ran for Senate, and that the first time I ran for Senate, I ran in 2004 and I lost by 18 votes. But in the longest unresolved race in New York State history, it was February of the following year that they told me that I'd lost. But again, it was I took on a 28-year incumbent. He was the deputy majority leader. There were all kinds of reasons why technically, this shouldn't even have been competitive. But I knew that I had to do it because of the things that I cared about on the state level and the way I cared about it. So it was kind of me after the initial seed. And I will say, though, with the leadership, that I never saw coming. There's never been a woman leader in the a conference in the history of New York State. There's just a lot of men in government, and they basically vote for each other. So when you see the three men in the room, it's the governor, it's the speaker, and it's the majority leader, and they've been men. Yeah. So we had a series of very difficult things that happened in our Democratic conference, and I think internally, you know, I mean, people have been talking about me as, you know, being the leader, and I didn't really see that coming. But again, you know, everybody, there were other people who wanted to do it, but the numbers weren't coming together for them, and it turned out in the same way when I go around and said, well, you know, people are talking to me about doing it. What do you think? And like, yeah. You know, so it turned out I had the numbers. I never thought that I did. So,
So now you're going to make the most of that, right?
well, I've been leader now for 5 years in the minority. And this November election, I said I have to hold on to all the seats that we have. And if we pick up one more seat, then we will be a united majority. And then, of course, the next step would be my colleagues, you know, reelect me, and then, yeah, I'd be the majority. Yeah, it is quite amazing.
So, Shelley, would you want to introduce, I asked everybody to sort of tell the story of how they jumped into leadership and running for office. And then the second question was really about who were some of the people that mentored you or pushed you to that place, if you needed it, or some people don't.
And I apologize for being late. I was at another candidate event since we're technically running for office. I apologize. But, so I'm Shelley Mayer, currently the senator for the 37th District. I was the assembly member for the last 6 years representing Yonkers, and Sarah Lawrence still in my district and was then very loyal. And thank you for doing this, Mara, and making it happen. Thank you. My father ran for office, some people have heard the story, 4 times as a Democrat in Yonkers in the old days when Democrats never won. And he did it really sort of as a point of pride, and I think we all can identify with that. He felt incredibly blessed to live in a democracy where you could represent a point of view, and I don't think he ever thought he would win, but he thought it was the right thing to do, and he was a very loyal Democrat. So I grew up in an environment where running and sometimes losing, and, you know, was part of the discussion. I was very much encouraged to have my own voice. And when I came, I tried to put my name in for judge several times, which was a great experience, and I wasn't successful, but I learned a lot. And then I learned, to the point I think probably everyone has said, is that I had my own voice, which I had been staff for a lot of men in politics for a long time, a lot of legislative people, but I had things I wanted to say, and I saw it differently, the world differently than them. So when the opportunity came, I moved back to Yonkers, I decided I would run for the assembly. I didn't think I was running against Mike Spano at the time, but it turned out I was. And we had a very intense race, and I lost by a small amount, and then he switched parties and became a Democrat, so I couldn't run again against him. But it was a sense that I wanted my own voice, and I would say that my family probably also that was a voice of validation, because there's a lot of moments when you lose confidence and you lose faith and your feelings get hurt, and all those things happen that women acknowledge much more openly than men, and that happened to me, of course, every time I ran. But my kids and my mother and father, my mother was still alive, and my husband, they were believers in me, and my women friends believed in me, and I think it was having my own voice, the opportunity to think I would actually be good at it, and I cared about people, and I would make a difference. So that's how I got started. Probably not different than everybody else.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a couple trends. I mean, I think you hear that family and being encouraged to have a voice is definitely part of it. I really relate to what you were saying also about the purpose. Like, why are you doing this? There's a job to be done, and that's sort of related to how your path started too, which there's a problem to be solved, and I think I can help solve it. And I think that those are themes that probably motivate a lot of, at least I don't want to say just women, but I think that a lot of the women I know who step into roles like this, there is a job to be done, and that is very motivating. So one question I would have is, I think there's a lot of women probably even in this audience, and by the way, if you're a man in this audience, thanks for being here. But I think that the question I have is, there's still an election to be run. And I think one of the things, you guys alluded to it, that you know, there's a lot of men in government and they vote for each other. And I don't know that women have always done a good well, I would say this applies to the business world too, of organizing and advising each other on how to tackle how to tackle things that can be contentious or stress-filled or conflict-filled. When I taught my class at Duke, I was struck by all the studies that show that women are much more conflict-avoiding than are men. And so what I wanted to ask about is, when did you first have to face that? How did you, in an election, where clearly that's a piece of it, there's adversaries in an election, what would be the advice you gave to someone coming behind you about how to approach that, your key lessons learned? Does that make sense? I'll start with you since you, no,
Well,
why not?
I think like most of us have tried to mentor other young women, because it takes somebody behind you and beside you, leading you down the path. And one candidate that I helped, as we prepared for the debate, sort of fell apart and started to cry in the debate prep. And in my heart of hearts, I thought to myself, I don't know, you have to have a certain degree of toughness to do it. I think you have to be able to get past your own weaknesses but at the same time show your vulnerability. It's a challenge to do it well, and I do think you get better in time. I mean, without, Andrea is my leader and my friend, but you get experienced in dealing with conflict when you are in political life, much more than women do probably in their other life where they avoid it. And I do think you get better over time in dealing with it in your own way and being a problem solver, as you said.
So it's something you learn as you go versus,
You get
is there
better.
any advice somebody could have given you head on, or is it all like you just got to learn as you go?
Well, my advice now is I have what I call a 4-hour rule. Like, you have 4 hours to get over feeling sorry for yourself. And I have told several men politicians they need to learn that rule. They have more problem than the women. They got to go home, cook dinner, feed the kids, blah, blah, blah. They're pretty good at it, but I think men could use a 4-hour rule. That's what
I love that, actually.
told them.
That's cute.
I'm going to remember that one. I think my kids are going to be hearing about it tonight, too.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with everything I think you said. I think my advice to anyone who would want to jump in any leadership capacity, whether it's elected office or anything, is, you have to have a thick skin. You really do. And, women tend to be maybe sometimes a little more sensitive, maybe, I think we're all very strong-minded. One thing that you said, and I think is very true and very important, and I'm a mother of 4. My kids were very young when I started. But I think women, and no offense to the men, but, we are good jugglers, right? We're good problem solvers because we have to be, especially if you're raising a family. And if you're juggling kids around and you're shuffling them around and you've got a schedule, you've got things to do, and you're going to make it happen, and you're going to figure out the best way and the most effective way, maybe the most economic way to make that thing happen. But, every now and then you have to have, things don't go your way. You have to have that 4-hour rule, because if you don't have a thick skin, if you can't let it roll off your back, you're not going to make it. You have to be a little tough, right? And I think we all have that toughness inside of us. So don't be afraid to channel that inner toughness, because it will serve you well. I know, my own, that's the way you got to roll, ladies, sometimes.
Well, and I think I want to ask a specific question around the fact, and this is on women and elected office, but clearly we have a diversity problem in elected office much more broadly than that. So I'm very interested in what steps you think the parties, or what are the tools we have at a local level beyond electing diverse candidates for increasing the diversity of representation in government, and how much of it what can an individual sitting here besides vote, everybody needs to vote, but what can individuals sitting here do I was struck a couple weeks ago. I was in D.C. and I went to the Capitol with my kids, the day the Kavanaugh hearings are going on. And no matter your politics, I think it's a low point in our civic discourse, civil discourse, what happened. And I'm struck as I'm sitting in the Capitol about this 7-minute video they've put together about our country. And I just was like, I want every person to see this video, because we've forgotten that we got to find the common, right? And you got to find the common by having lots of people at the table who look different, act different, feel different, but somehow agree to cobble this all together. So I happen to be biased, and I believe that's a huge priority. What are the specific steps you think individuals and communities can take to making that reality?
You're looking at me.
I am, because you brought up that you were the first You're the first, you actually, desegregation was at the core of why you got involved.
Yeah.
And that you realized there was an opportunity in helping to get you elected to diversify the voices at the table. And I think it would be easy for me to, I just am interested in your experience.
My first run, I ran against an African American.
Okay.
So I didn't, I ran against an African American. So that wasn't my motive. My motivation was I thought that things could be done differently. But I understand your
First,
question.
if I was right, you got involved in electing
Because
the
of
mayor who cared about.
who was willing to comply with
Right,
desegregation.
exactly.
I mean, we were in 1992.
Right,
you know,
exactly.
in New York.
Right, I mean-
So I really was. I still remember. Back then we were looking at Ted Koppel, and they had. They had elected Hank Spallone at some point, and my husband and I, we were traveling with the kids, and here's this guy, Nightline, it's, all over the nation, and this guy, you remember, Kathleen, and here's Hank Spallone saying, we're not going to do this, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I'm so embarrassed. Yeah, it was, so anyway, I think that people learn what they live, and I believe that what we're doing now and the continued encouragement, I don't think that women and people of color, especially in this moment of history, are waiting for somebody to tell them that they have to jump in.
No, they're jumping in.
I hope not, because clearly there is a need. Not everybody thinks, like you do, that the diversity is important. Not everybody believes that all voices should be at the table. Some people believe that the framers of the Constitution constituted exactly the way they were. Apparently, we're perfectly fine. So I think we have to decide what kind of America we want, and we have to work, each of us, to craft, our vision. And so I think this is a particularly important time in history where people who might have sat on the sidelines, I believe, are stepping forward. So, I mean, you learn by example, you learn by get involved in your political organizations. They said, but now we've got the main parties, and then you've got the indivisibles who are doing all kinds of other things. I know I belong to the Black Women's Political Caucus, which is a very important voice in terms of Black women in politics, and I know the Latino organizations are coming up, Asian, I mean, everybody I think is engaged. So, but just really briefly too, the answers that they gave in terms of what people should know, are extremely true and important. But like I said, I just wanted to let people know that however you are now isn't the way because I never even spoke in front of people. I was absolutely paranoid. I was phobic until really I was an adult, So the thing is, I just need for people to know that whoever you are right now doesn't mean that you're going to be that forever. It doesn't. So take it one step at a time. But if you know yourself, like if you know that you're never going to be able to have people say bad things about you that you're ever going to recover from, then you don't need to be in this. I mean, I really never felt that I would ever be able to take, and I used to, if my mother screamed at me when I was little, I would cry. I was like, but now, but after the first time it happens to you and the second time it happens to you, you're like, okay, we're in a fight. And then you got to fight. But for the most important thing I would say is that you have to know yourself, because they're going to say things about you. They're going to paint you in all kinds of ways that don't, identify with who you think you are. But you really lose if you start getting so concerned with whoever it is they're saying you are, and you start buying into that. So it's a head game. So you got to know who you are, because they're going to say anything.
I think that this over and over when I was teaching my class on leadership, women like you who were leading in the corporate sector or philanthropy or whatever would say they never thought they could do what they had done when they were sitting, however many years prior. And it was the doing and the talking and the engaging and the interacting and realizing what job needed to be done that sort of put them on the path. Like I always say, my path makes perfect sense in the rearview mirror, but it really actually didn't at the time during much of my life. So, and I also think there's something, I don't know if you guys would agree with this, since I turned 40, there's something incredibly freeing about having so much experience behind you and so many contacts and relationships that suddenly you realize you have a base to build with, a base of friends and allies that you've worked with through the years. So, I mean, I think that's interesting. I worry a lot about just how newcomers break in. I think you're right. We're in a moment in time where the opportunity is now, and that we need many more voices at the table. But what do you think, I guess what I would ask, and I hate to ask this question, but do you think your gender has impacted the way you run for office or what is expected of you when you run? I always hate this question. It's sort of like, how do you balance work and like how are you a mom and you work full time? It's always like the standard question, but you work with mostly male colleagues in these roles. What do you see as the key differences both in how you got here and then how you do the job day to day? Do you have any perspective on this? I mean, you're in a little bit of a different position, but.
Right. Well, I guess I go back to, we have to stop being each other's worst critic. I mean, I lose my mind when nobody opined on President Obama's suits, and yet every woman's haircut and and I just want to say, just unite, just have some feeling of support. We really demand too much of, would argue, other women. We put other women in the crosshairs that I would argue we don't do it to a man, and it's a disservice to every one of us. And I really do get frustrated by that. I do.
What do you think?
Yeah, I'm just going back over my own elections and people I've worked with, and I've probably worked with more men than women.
Yep.
But then at the county board, there was a fair amount of women. I've run against women and I've run against men, and I think I've treated them as equals, and I think they've treated me the same. I saw no difference in the way we both approached arguments or ideas or thoughts. There wasn't any. It was, sometimes they were, horrible and you had to really have a thick skin. But no, I didn't see a huge difference. I ran against men and women, and I think, at least from my experience, I really don't have a huge difference between them.
Well, I think the movements of the last year or two, the Me Too movement particularly, and this is not directly responsive to your question, but I do think it changed a little bit of the traditional formulation of women entering a man's field. It used to be that we sort of wanted a seat at the table, and that was viewed as the goal, a seat at the table. Whatever sort of slings and arrows came with it, you sort of put up with along the path because you wanted that seat at the table, and that was it. I think, credit to the Me Too movement, they sort of changed the equation. Like, no, we're not accepting these things as a condition for having a seat at the table anymore. We are going to demand a seat at the table. These are our conditions. We are not going to sort of put up with the stuff. And I know, as a person who was in the 60s, there were things that were just sort of acceptable things you had to go through in order to be in these political worlds. And I think that the movement of the last 2 years has, even though it's messy and social movements are messy, it is an opportunity to say we need to think about it differently. And that's why I do think, to your point, Andrea, young women are running for office who didn't wait their turn to climb up the ladder. I ran once and lost, now I have a chance to run. No, they're like, no, I'm going to run now. I'm sorry if you don't like it. I am doing it now, and win or lose, and a number of them won in our conference. They just said, we're not waiting our turn, and we're not standing on the sideline, and we're not waiting for the traditional, I'll have my seat at the table time. So I do think the equation for women in power has changed, and I think it's an overall
But
good thing.
a really good point.
But I will say, certainly, there is, you know, I've run against men, I've run against women, and, but I will say, certainly as an African-American woman, you know, there's still, and I saw it, I think even with Hillary or whatever, you could see that the dynamic about how she was perceived and kind of focused on in a variety of different ways is not the same way that I mean, like I said, if I just can't imagine any woman actually saying the kinds of things that the current president says and still be in office. I just can't see it. I don't believe that would happen. So I think that because we are still new in the game to some extent, that you know, people are still sort of watching how we do, what we do. You know, I don't have any doubt that should I wind up being the first female majority leader. I mean, listen, when I first got elected leader, you know, there were people like, oh, well, you know, she must be somebody's puppet, you know. It's really this guy and that guy who's, you know, put her there. It's unfortunate, but, you know, after a while, you know, that went away. But the thing is that you've got to be aware of all of that kind of, you know, backstage stuff. And you have to be very deliberate in terms of your message and your message to the public, because they're looking at you with lenses that are already biased because of the historical context of where you've been. So people come with their baggage. I don't care, you know, who you are. You come with what you know. And if you come with the mindset, well, you know, people are supposed to look like this in that position, and if this person were that, then that would have happened, then you should be cognizant of that as you chart your own way. But there is, I think, still women are scrutinized, and we will, you know, continue to exceed. And I will also say that the best thing for me, you know, if you're talking about making lemonade out of lemons, is that people, you know, underestimate me. You know, and they're like, oh, her. Okay. That's fine.
Well, you mentioned the GI Bill earlier, which is a little bit of a departure from that question, but you're talking about history and knowing your historical context. And I think when I was teaching my class, I taught 3 semesters in a row, and the thing I increased every semester is I added a class on history, because I don't think we know how recent our rights actually are, because it's not really taught in that lens. And I think that the urgency that I could see in my students' faces when they sort of realized the structural impediments to equality that exist, and you said it actually perfectly before too, which is sort of like we're a paradox. This country has got things both ways. The same country that is amazing in these ways has set up the system in these ways, and I think it was mind-blowing to me to see, like, the first class, I said, you know, and I don't mean this for anyone who's young, you may not, I'm sure you do because you're at Sarah Lawrence, but my Duke students, I said, do you guys know who some of these feminist leaders were? And the one I thought they would all know was Gloria Steinem, because she was the most commercial, right? And she's still alive, and she was the most commercial at the time.
That's right.
Nobody knew her.
Wow. Yeah.
And that was like such a wake-up call for me, that this process of really teaching the history across the board is critical to keeping our feet to the fire. And the other thing, when I was offered to teach at Women as Leaders by this old professor of mine, I looked at, and I totally get your answer, but I said, I don't think being a woman has really affected my career. I've had male mentors, I've had female mentors, and this is an old professor of mine, so she had glasses on, she goes, I think you should think harder about that and get back to me. And the truth is, it hadn't. I got along on one level, but I really didn't understand the other stuff that was going on that I'd been working around my whole life, that you just sort of learn to work around. And I do think we're in a moment where maybe that can change, hopefully. I don't want to dominate these guys. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I'm sure that you have them. I have more questions myself, but I thought I would open it up and see if anyone wants to start, and there's a bias towards students asking first.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. I have a whole syllabus that I'd be happy to share with you. It's not all feminist theory, but so I always say to people, the reason I'm a visiting lecturer and not like a professor of the practice, which is a university designation, is I'm not a PhD. I'm like a go out and do the work. So a lot of my syllabus did focus on people doing the work and the practical application of leadership, but I do have some suggestions I could definitely get to you if you're interested. I don't know if you guys, yeah, go ahead.
I just would say, you know, one of the fun things about coming to Sarah Lawrence is questions like that, but for those of us, like in the tangible political world, I think I would love to be exposed to more feminist theory, but I would be very honest, it's not something I'm reading every day. You know, I'm in the battle for our conference to, you know, walking door to door and doing those things. And so the opportunity to talk about theory is very enticing to me because I'm intellectually interested. But it is, you know, and it's one of the good things of having this. The challenge is, for those of us in this very nitty-gritty world of electoral politics, is it's hard to find time for theory. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure we would benefit if we knew some. At least I would.
Yes.
So you were talking about the 1192 concept alone. I was saying we're not going to do this. And very good I didn't know this was true back there. And we were thinking, well, anyway, so, and we were just like, we were reading the history of the newspaper things, and we were also like, it was 92. Like, what's going on?
There you go.
So I just wondered,
To my world.
you know, if you have any opinion on how the young political landscape has maybe changed, you're reworking or rethinking locally?
Has it, well, again, you know, the good news, I think a lot has changed. I think that apparently what the case said was that there was a concerted effort to do what was done over a 40-year period. And, you know, what I found is that a lot of the communities, a lot of the resistance was, you know, for all the things that we still are working with today, you know, fear, ignorance, bigotry, you know, people who find it more beneficial for their own motivation to pit one group against the other. And I think the reality is that that stuff never goes away. So it's now, do you elect people, again, as I say, everybody brings their stuff, you know, so if you used to systems that don't allow for diversity and don't think people are deserving of what you have and so on and so forth, and then you run for office and you come in and you put policies in place like that, that's what you get. So people like me, I think there's been new waves and new generations like Shelley or whatever in Yonkers who realize that it could go either way because money and power are very much in politics. You know, who gets opportunities to do what, where, you know, again, depend on policies and politics. So I think the more people who have a vision that is more inclusive who run for office, the more likely you are to have a government that demonstrates that. And I think this, again, this moment is so critical because, you know, we are looking, to me, on a national level, and I mean, I was just on the phone yesterday with the conference call where we were talking about, you know, the bringing people in who are, you know, who really are nationalists and so on and so forth, affiliating with, I mean, we're in a place where a lot of stuff that you thought was behind you, whether it's women's rights, whether it's voting rights, we are in a place where a lot of these things are calling into question, going back to Ms. Hood's assessment of the situation, and they haven't been that long. We're talking about 92, but the reality is that, yeah, it was 92. And people were still talking about whether or not we integrate, and people felt like, oh no, we didn't really segregate, you know, we were just living here and blah, blah, blah. They didn't realize that the people who were running the place were doing things to segregate. They thought they were just living their lives. They didn't realize it, and that's the difference, you know, so governing matters. Who's in government matters.
And I
Because
think
most people are busy.
this sort of gets to the history matters. So so what you're studying, I mean, I remember learning about, I thought the women's movement happened like years before I was born, you know, and the answer is no, it's about 5 years, you know, it's like, and so, or I was right born in the middle of it, but when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, that was a thing of the, it's not, these are recent rights, these are recent developments, and to a certain extent, we should be disappointed in some ways that we haven't made greater progress, I think, but it's also, we're this congressional video, I'm like, we are a young country. It is imperative now that we sort of build the country we want for the next however many years. But I do think this history and how we think about what we teach our kids and show our kids is another really important piece of it. Yep.
I mean, even in Yonkers, they don't teach about the DSEG case.
Right.
Which is, you know, I think is very telling. I mean, you know, you should be telling people why there's busing and why this and that,
Right.
but people don't know.
Yep.
But
Any other?
you know what, I would just say, I think we're only going to get, I think the one art that we have lost is listening to each other. And if we don't start, I mean, I think we've got to seek out the smartest people you know who don't agree with you.
I agree.
And how are we going to change things unless, if you blind yourself to what the other side is thinking?
Exactly.
And, you know, the First Amendment isn't for only people who agree with you.
That's right.
It's-
You're right.
And we really have to actively just look for smart people who have a mindset that's different from yours and actively learn where they're going. Because otherwise, if we all just stay in our lane, we're just not going to
We're
get
not gonna
there.
do.
No.
That's why women in this are good.
Well, that's what I was going to say, you know, I have found.
Women talk.
In my years in the legislature and elsewhere, that women, on the whole, were better at listening, including to those who disagreed, and also finding common ground with disagreement.
Right.
I know, you know, in the legislature and in panels like this, you know, the ability, women tend to be better at listening and find, you know, like we disagree about 20%, we agree about 80%, let's work on the 80% we agree on. Men, so that's one of the benefits of having more women in office, in my opinion, is the listening and the working and the getting stuff done is improved.
I know there's a question in the back, but
Yes,
one of the soapboxes that I've been on lately is that, and this is because we work with so many young people and we are more connected than ever before, but we've sort of traded community for connectedness. And I am my new head of marketing is like, you have zero digital footprint. This is like not good. But it's because I believe in face-to-face. Like I really, and to your point about talking to people that might have differences, and I guess my question is on this selfish question is, do you see how technology in the last 10 years in particular, I would say, or 5 years, how has that changed how you communicate, the depth of the engagement with your constituents, or what it looks like? Has it not? Is that a really overly simplistic question to ask? I'm sure it is, but I'm interested in your thoughts. I don't know.
Yeah, I will tell you this, and certainly just in the past, our family got our first computer, I think, in 1998. So, and then we became really, as your kids come along, your family grows, you acquire, right, stuff, a lot of electronics. But, I think from my perspective, just doing work, I think the electronics and the texting and the emails really did allow me to manage my time better. Because I was not a sit behind the, a desk kind of gal. I was, you would probably recognize me better in jeans and work boots and in the community. I'd much rather be out there, I guess, using that time that you just saved over here in the face-to-face with the constituents. But I think there's definitely something to be said for the electronics. If you can manage your time and if it can aid you in doing that, it's a plus. It really is. At least it served me very well in that regard because it freed up so many other hours that I could go out and do things in the community or sit down and talk with somebody on the other side of the aisle and find that common ground, because that's important too.
Does it change how you engage with your constituents?
Well, it definitely does for, in the sense that social media is very much part of the political presence that you have. One thing I do is I do not engage in what I would call fighting on social media. I find that to be a counterproductive thing. I'd much rather disagree with someone in person and again find the human touch and where we might agree and disagree. And then there's also a tremendous tendency to be extremely ugly in social media because it's anonymous and you're not physically there, and that's not my style. I don't like it. I shy away from that, and I'm very turned off by that kind of particularly anonymous ugliness, and that really I think is not a productive part of our discourse. And there's a lot of that in our electoral world. A lot of it. I tend to post a lot, but I don't engage. When someone writes some hateful thing back, I just sort of move on and pay no attention.
It's funny, I had 2 experiences where people just said things that were so wrong and so hateful, so I just found out their address and went and rang their bell.
Welcome to Bronxville.
And they're like, oh no.
And they were like,
Oh my goodness.
and it was like, I didn't say that, and I said, no, you did,
Right.
so let's go,
start right.
yeah, let's go from there, so, yeah.
We certainly say, people say things online that you would never say face to
Never
face. I
say.
think that's very, very
Absolutely.
true. Someone had a question in the back, sorry. Yes.
I'm sure you are probably sick of hearing questions about like the current presidential situation, but I'll ask you a question about the current presidential situation. I'm curious, I feel like as college students we are very limited to this sort of 21st century perspective, which is also related to the technology that you're talking about. And when you're talking about everything that you just said and everything about context and understanding when these movements came about and what our current social situation truly is, and how our understanding of that sometimes isn't quite developed, I'm curious if the results of the 2016 presidential election surprised you as women who've been in politics and been in office for all of this time, if the pervading attitudes of like the American public surprised you at that time, or you were like, yeah.
Well, I thought I was shocked, but it also, in my weird mind, reinforced that in a strange way we live in a bubble, East Coast, West Coast, and there was a lot of the country that I obviously wasn't paying attention to because I was shocked. So I sort of felt, there was a great line, somebody on CNN was talking about some issue and they said, would you stop it? That's an Acela problem. Because it's the people, and I thought to myself, what an interesting, so it was a wake-up call for me to get a little smarter.
Raise your hand if you weren't shocked.
Yeah,
I actually wasn't shocked.
you weren't, I was.
Because I travel around the country.
Okay.
So I go to Northeast Florida and, South Carolina, and I live in New York, which is a bubble for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
But I realized I saw no Clinton signs anywhere, like in those markets. And even here, which is a pretty, it's New York, right?
Right.
There just was not a lot of
Overt.
overt support, and I had moments in cabs with cab drivers where people who I would have stereotyped that they'd be Clinton voters actually told me why they were going to vote for Trump.
Wow.
I know, and that whole, I think she was a very polarizing candidate. When I was I was a big supporter. I really want I want somebody to break through the glass ceiling. And to be perfectly honest, when I taught my class, I learned the first woman to break through to the next level of government is usually a daughter or a wife.
Yeah.
So if that is the truth, which it is, in every breakthrough, you have to be a daughter or a wife, and you carry those credentials with, and that's historically been true. Maybe it's going to have to change, but I thought she was the best person positioned to make that breakthrough, and I was a fan. But when I traveled around, there were no signs. People did not want to really talk about it. So about a week before the election, I was away with some friends. I said, "You guys, I think she's going to lose." And they're like, "You are totally crazy." I'm like, "I'm just telling you. I just feel it." And I think we do live in a bubble.
Yeah.
And I think technology has enabled us to extend that bubble. Part of the reason I have no social media footprint is I deleted my Facebook and my Twitter account after the election, and then again last year, because the algorithms feed you what you want to hear.
Right.
And it's awful. Like you only see people who, when you like things, and then they feed you what you want to hear. And that's that's part of the echo chamber we're in right now,
Yes.
I think. I don't know if you guys agree.
I just want to add one thing to it, though. I don't disagree with you, but I think we fool ourselves to say that we live in a bubble. I said to people after, and I was very disappointed and surprised when Hillary lost, but talk to your garbage man. Don't say you don't know anyone who voted for Trump, because I can assure you that there's a lot of people, like in my district, that voted for Trump. I spoke to them. They liked not what he said, but how he said it, and the fact that he was sort of going to change things up and he wasn't politically correct. There were things about him that were appealing, and if we only talk to people who agree with each other and ourselves, we can find our bubble. But my point is, it's not only East Coast, West Coast. We have to do a better job of talking to working people and each other and people who disagree with us. And look, I'd like to think I could have talked some of them out of voting for Trump personally. But I do think we have our challenges right here, because we did have people who are like our constituents and colleagues who very much supported him, and I think we had strong disagreements, and now I think the world has changed a little since he's been in. But I don't think it's only a seller problem. I think we need to talk to people who disagree in our own worlds.
Yes, over here. Yep. Oh, sorry, I didn't see your hand. Apologies.
Data for Mayor Marvin. Would you consider joining Climate Mayors, the bipartisan coalition for leadership in climate change?
Absolutely. I mean, I would absolutely have to do more of my homework, because I join on do nothing until I'm well-read and well-versed, but completely open.
Yes, I have a question too. So I feel like a lot of people nowadays are feeling pretty discouraged about saying that, everyone should have a voice, but yet it feels like change isn't being made. So I guess my question is, how would you recommend staying optimistic when you feel like your message isn't getting across, and what advice would you give for young people who are feeling discouraged?
Who would like to take that?
Yeah, I'll start. And the senator said something earlier that it's something I find myself saying all the time. And she said, people are busy, right? People are busy and they're not informed. I think you said something to that effect. And my best advice is to be informed about as much as possible. If you even have an inkling of getting involved politically, start small, right? Start baby steps, right? We all do baby steps. And when I had a radio show, I did WVOX, and we've all done WVOX, right?
Yeah.
And people would call up and be like, I'm so mad, I didn't know that was on the agenda. And I would say every week, read your local agenda, right? Most of us have computers. Go to your computer, pull up the agenda. It's easy. And it's out there, right? We have this fantastic digital world of information. Utilize it, grab it. be informed about, just start small, what's going on in your library, right? Go to a library board meeting. What policies are they thinking about enacting or maybe getting rid of? Go to a village board meeting, go to a Bronxville meeting. Here's this on my bucket list, going to a Yonkers City Council meeting. I've never gone, and I hear it's wild, right?
Yeah,
But these are the things you should do. And one of the things that I do, and I'm a Republican, I'm a proud Republican, but I've worked well with Democrats on the other side of the aisle, men and women, and every night I sit down and I put on Fox News, and then I go to CNN. Right? Because not everything they're saying over here, there has to be another side. Not everything Sean Hannity's saying is right. So let me go listen to what CNN's saying. And when you do that, right, and Shelley, the senator, sorry, she alluded to it, and I found this really true and phenomenal at the county board, when the Democrats and the Republicans were kind of equal, when not one party was way tipping the scales in either direction, more stuff, right, got done. Because it forced us to compromise. There is common ground, there has to be, find it, sit down and find it, and from that common ground comes your compromise. And so, but I think just for your own edification, watch some Fox, watch some CNN. Go to your local village, pull up an agenda. When do they meet? Do they meet once a month, twice a month? What are they talking about? What's Mary gonna vote on this week? It's just a good place to start.
I was just going to say that it's easy to get discouraged because it's convenient. But as somebody, they said, sitting here in the position that I'm in, the historic position I'm in as an African-American woman, whose ancestors, we all know the story more or less, I hope. Please don't raise your hand and tell me you don't know. Please, but yeah, don't. I won't ask. But the reality is that, Barack Obama was elected president, and there are people who never, ever, ever thought that would happen. And as you're being reminded that things that we now have, we didn't have before. I mean, people talk about daycare. I mean, you name it. The daycare isn't like, oh, everybody had daycare. No. It was a socially responsible thing to do so that women who, could and had to and wanted to work outside of the home, were able to put their children hopefully in safety. But I'm just saying to you, in our time of instant gratification, it's not like that. But if you pay attention to something that you really care about, and you find like-minded people who will help you in that, don't worry about the time, if it doesn't happen by January of 2019, I'm going to drop it. No, just find your passion and be passionate about it. That's what moves the world.
Plus, I think you can find, I have a real interest in local district attorneys' races, because you look around the country and they're incarcerating people based on, a drug habit, based on their color. At the local district attorneys level, some good things and some incredibly bad things are happening. So for you to find somebody and, a $50 donation to them means an awful lot of money. $50 in a $1 billion presidential campaign means nothing. So I would almost educate myself where, and I happen to believe it's at the local district attorney levels in the country. So I agree with you, start small and don't give up.
Don't give up.
I just want to add that I spend as much time as possible actually going door to door to speak to voters. And it is it is uplifting. Every day you hear all this stuff, and then you go and talk to real people. Nothing against Fox and CNN, but they are not talking to any real people. Last night I was out for an hour in upstate New York, knocking on doors of real people, not all Democrats, some are Republicans, some are not affiliated for a particular candidate, and do it as much as possible. You will find yourselves feeling so much better about Americans as a whole if you actually go to a door and engage with a person who is willing to listen, who has their things they care about, whose life is not revolved around all that we're talking about, and who really appreciates that someone wants to listen to them and their views. So I find it a very encouraging thing and something that everybody can do for whoever they choose to.
Yes, and then up here, sorry.
So I want to talk also at the local level, but also bring back what the senator said about people are busy and they're not informed. I was interested in knowing how we are informing people about their wonderful right to vote as an American citizen. And I know that I think that all of you probably have encountered these problems. We were reading about Balkans, also the Junkers program.
Show me a
Surely
hero.
And it's consistent turnout that the east side
Yes.
always have a higher percentage of voter turnout
Used to
than the
be.
west side. And we were also talking in class about technology as also, I suppose, a useful means of conversation, of communication, but also as a barrier to people who don't have laptops, don't have cell phones. So I'm interested in knowing who are informing these people who have their about their wonderful democracy, and also what like just that.
So I think you're asking, how do you reach people who may not be?
How do you reach people in general, and
Yeah.
how do you reach people who might not be knowing, who might not be interested in voting, who might not know what change that they can make by their voting?
You know what? I hate to continue on the same note, but the reality is that people respond to what's going on in their lives. So not only are they busy, but until you're actually impacting them as far as they're concerned, they don't really come out, right? So if somebody's saying, oh, I'm gonna, take down every tree, on your block, oh, Tuesday night, there's gonna be a meeting about it, everybody's gonna be there, oh my gosh, we moved here with these trees, all of a sudden, we're gonna have noise,
But Wednesday morning, they're calling you, right?
Huh?
Wednesday morning, they're calling you,
Exactly.
going, was there a meeting? What happened? Where'd the trees
Exactly.
go?
Yeah, but many of them are there and like, what are you gonna do to protect my trees? We voted for you, you better.
Right.
But it just has to kind of creep up on you for you to pay attention to what's going on in the world around you. And that's why as traumatized as many people are, I'm not saying everybody, but as traumatized as people are from, what we're looking at every day, it's almost kind of a wake up. This is because somebody, maybe not you, voted, somebody didn't vote, and then I'll tell you something, I had some circumstances on the state level that were kind of difficult, to say the least. So part of the problem that we had is that there was a group of Democrats called the IDC that were affiliating with Republicans, but they've been doing this for 7 years. Nobody cared. I cared, because no matter how many members I would add to our conference, there would, because of the affiliation with the Republicans, we could never become the majority. Nobody cared. When the 2016 happened, and they realized that it was going to be another 4 years before there was a shot at that, they started looking at state governments, because state governments obviously have a lot of influence as well. And that was the first time they actually looked at New York State and saying, what? You know what I mean? I was running around, and all of our members, we were like, nobody. Then they looked and they said, oh my gosh, this is happening? How could this be happening? Well, guess what? It's not happening anymore. Because people felt impacted. That's the only thing. You just got to educate them and then be patient enough for them to have something that happens to them. And then you can tell them where to go.
I see another question in the back, and then I want people who are not students to feel free to ask questions too. Sorry, I should have probably said that, but in the back, in the middle?
Andrea had said be deliberate in terms of your message, so I'm wondering what each of you feels like your messages are and how you came to have those messages, and maybe also do you feel that you are able to sort of enact that message?
Does anyone want to start?
Well, it's sort of a big question. A lot of opinionated women. So I think for us, the Senate Democratic Conference led by Andrea, this is our moment. We are hopeful that we're going to be in the majority. Our message is we will make a difference in people's lives once we get to be a majority, and we will be a diverse group of people who represent all different areas of the state and all different views. We're bound together by certain common principles, and we believe we will make a difference in people's lives if we're in the majority. I hate to be partisan, but that's what, we got 3 weeks left, and I'm in the partisan place.
Right, zone.
Yeah, I'm in the zone.
Well, and you're not in an elected position.
I'm not. One of the things that I found myself campaigning on a lot, and because I had real concern, and it was something that I felt I was impacted by, was the tax issue in Westchester County. We are the highest taxed county in the nation. And as a mother of 4, and my husband and I, our taxes are very high. Everything is very expensive here. And when you go and knock on the doors, right, and we've all done it, we continue to do it, I could go up and down the street and tell you whose husband was just laid off, whose home was in foreclosure, who was selling their home, right, because they couldn't pay the taxes. So that was always one of my biggest things. I was never really out there campaigning on the social issues. I felt it didn't have a role at the most local, unless there was something going on, then of course it does. But my sort of thing was always the taxes. That, as a government, we can't spend more than we take in. It's common sense, right? I've got, my kids were little at one time, and they knew. They could spend more than if they had $2 in their hand. They couldn't spend $2.50 because they didn't have it. So I tried to hone in. I was the chair of the budget committee for a number of years, and I really tried to just be very diligent about diving down into the numbers. So, and for a lot of people, the taxes are going to be their biggest concern, and that's an issue. There's a lot of issues, but that's one that's not going away. It's growing. It is a monster that the state and our country has to face, right? They've got to do something, because we do, at least in my opinion, I don't speak for everybody, we do see the middle class fading away, right? And you're going to have a 2-class system. You're going to have wealthy, and you're going to have people that don't have a lot of money at all, and the middle class seems to be falling by the wayside. So, my 2 cents.
Totally agree. And I think you have to tell people, you have to be a good steward. It's not our money. We have to be guardians. If anything, you should care for other people's money more than your own. And I think the idea that people have to be able to live in a community. And I think the other issues are people need a quality of life. And you really have to care about those things, where they live, their neighborhood. So I would say it's how you spend their very hard-earned money, and then what kind of quality of life you offer to the people that you're representing.
Well, I agree with all those messages, and they're very specific messages. And I guess for what I was saying when I was saying you have to be clear about your message, I mean, what are you bringing to people? So why do they want you as opposed to Joe Schmo? So you can't go to this group and say, oh, well, I really care about this, and then you're over here saying I really care about that. And, so if you're going to lead, you have to lead. And then you're selling yourself. So you got to convince people why you would be a good leader. So that's why I say be clear on your messaging. I'm going to do this, not just smear your opponent, unless, if they're crooks,
Your way.
I'm just saying, okay, so you might want to point out facts about the person you're running against.
Just
okay?
factual.
Just be, but, but the thing is, why are you better? And so that's the clarity that you need on your messaging. And if your constituents, your constituents are really overwhelmingly interested in quality of life and taxes and social, you got to figure out who your audience is. I mean, if your audience is worried about gun safety, then and you've got a plan and you've got a voice, then that's what your messaging has to be.
I can see that we are actually out of time. I'm so sorry, but.
There's one man you can't.
Oh, well,
you can't not.
my vision, yes. All right, last question from the guy in the back. No.
Hello, my name is Caleb Wells. Thank you for being here today. We're all sitting back here, this group, because we're in a class talking about Yonkers, as it's already been said. And as an academic, I understand my personal responsibility is to produce research and material that then politicians can then use to communicate like the issues that are going on and best practices of dealing with that. I was curious on how you collaborate with academics and with people that are dealing research to then make sure that your policies are addressing the issues and solving them.
Well, I would just say, just as we did a tax reassessment of the village, which sounds small, but I think the smartest people are the people who know what they're not smart at. And then you go find the people, and you have to actively find the people. And to me, that's just the sign of a smart person sitting there and saying, so we actively reach out to academics. I mean, that was an issue in particular, that we reached out to so many different kinds of people. I just think it's imperative. I think it's real hubris to think you can do it yourself.
And I would just add to that a little bit. When I said I was a professor of the practice, it's sort of one of our mantras at One Love is that we want to talk to young people in a language they can hear. And you heard some description, like when we're doing our work now, I have public health experts say, oh my gosh, you're doing everything that we said we should do in papers 20 years ago, but you're actually doing it. And I think it's this marriage of the research and then how you talk to people in a way they can hear. And I think that's the same thing with, I would guess it's the same thing with politics, is sometimes we, and even to the feminist theory question a little bit, I've noticed since I started doing the work I do that there's certain words where people go, oh, that's not my thing. Like, what, for example, abuse and violence are two words that people go, that's somebody else's deal, that's not mine. But if you talk about healthy and unhealthy relationships and disseminate the same information but within a language people can hear, your adoption rate's much higher. So I think it's an incredibly important partnership between those doing the research and then those who can talk, who know the market and can message it. But sometimes those worlds don't meet. And I think in sort of wrapping up, to your question about how overwhelming the world can be, I actually, we've worked with 350,000 young people across the country, and I've said many times, like, I'm envious of your generation, and I'm also totally overwhelmed on your behalf. Because you have visibility into this giant world and all of its problems. When I was growing up, I did not have that visibility. We didn't have 24-hour news. We didn't have social media or online. So I saw what was right in front of me. And that felt a whole heck of a lot more manageable than what you guys see now. And when you ask why is mental health, why are teen mental health challenges and anxiety, depression, and loneliness is the #1 issue that the Surgeon General thinks we're facing from a medical perspective in this country, because we're looking at a world that's too big for us to humanly tackle. So I think this point about finding your work, what is the work you want to do in your community? When I sit at my desk too long and read articles and think about how big the problems are, I very quickly tell myself nothing's fixable. But when I get out and I start talking to people and I start realizing that person by person, you can get real progress, you get your hope back. So I would say start local. And really focus on the thing you want to fix. You can't fix it all. And someday you'll be able to fix more and more as you build your track record of what you're good and what you're capable of doing. But I understand why you're overwhelmed. And I think I would just say start with what's the work right in front of you that you want to do. Yeah.
Can I just address you, because I think everything you've said, especially about grassroots. My name is Susan Burkett, and one of the team members. We're heading up something on Save Scoutfield, which is a local organization, grassroots, we're a mural. We're trying to preserve the park. It's right down the block, very easy to find. You should check us out because I find that I channel a lot of my anger about what's going on in the world with working with this group. We've had great success so far. It ain't over yet. We've gotten support from a lot of key politicians, and I think it's really important if anybody wants
What's
to
the name of the
involved.
group again? It's hard to hear you.
Well, I'm sorry if I always get told.
The
Save
group.
Scoutfield, but also in terms of starting small, Mark Zuckerberg grew up next door to my family's house, so I used to see that kid running around in his diapers under the sprinkler. So I'm saying we started small, we can all start small, but the whole question I wanted to say was, working with small grassroots organizations can be just as effective as running for office. So check us out, we need your help, we need
So
your
we made a promise to our guests who have many appointments that they're keeping that we would finish on time. So I want to thank you all for being with us. I want to thank all of our panelists.